Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with two lonely souls finding shelter in each other's brokenness. In the harsh Scottish highlands, Brida arrives at a remote farmstead as payment for her father's debts, expecting nothing but more rejection from the giant Viking warrior who is now her husband. Thorfinn built this quiet farm dreaming of a family he never thought he'd have. She's 19, cast aside by her own family for her size, carrying shame like a stone in her chest. He's battle-scarred and weary, his massive frame hiding a heart that's forgotten how to hope. But as autumn turns to winter, something unexpected blooms between them. When Brida discovers she's carrying his child, old fears return. She's terrified of passing her pain to another generation. Yet when Thorfinn kneels beside her and promises they'll meet their son by spring, his words carry more weight than any wedding vow. In a world that showed them both cruelty, they're about to discover if love really can heal old wounds. Will two outcasts find in each other what the world never gave them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cart lurched to a stop on the rocky path, and Brida's stomach churned with more than just the rough journey. Through the morning mist, she could see the farmstead that would now be her home, a collection of stone buildings nestled against the hillside like they'd grown from the earth itself. The main house sat solid and weathered, its thick walls promising shelter from the highland winds that had already chilled her to the bone during the 3-day journey from her father's village. Her father hadn't even looked back when he'd handed her over to the trader who would deliver her here. Payment for debts, he'd muttered, as if she were livestock being sold at market. The shame of it still burned in her throat, mixing with the fear of what awaited her in this remote place. The door of the farmhouse opened, and Brida's breath caught. The man who emerged was enormous, not just tall, but broad through the shoulders and chest, his presence filling the doorway like a mountain filling the horizon. His hair was dark blonde, streaked with early silver, and hung past his shoulders in the old way. Scars marked his hands and forearms, visible even from where she sat frozen in the cart. This was Thorfinn Eriksson, the Viking warrior who had somehow become her husband through her father's desperation and this man's need for a wife. She had expected cruelty. Every man she'd known had looked at her with disgust or pity. Her own father, worst of all. At 19, she carried more weight than other girls her age, and her family had never let her forget it was a burden, a shame, something that made her unworthy of love or kindness. But when Thorfinn approached the cart, his steps were measured, careful, and when he looked up at her, she saw no mockery in his grey eyes. "Brida?" His voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting orders in battle, but surprisingly gentle. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands trembled as she gathered her few possessions, a worn cloak, a small bundle of clothes, and the cracked hand mirror her mother had left her years ago. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," he said, extending a massive hand to help her down from the cart. His palm was warm and calloused, completely engulfing her smaller hand. He didn't grip too tightly, didn't rush her as she found her footing on the uneven ground. When she stumbled slightly, his other hand steadied her elbow with surprising gentleness for someone whose hands had clearly known violence. The trader accepted his payment and left without ceremony, leaving Brida standing beside this giant of a man in front of what was now her home. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind through the pine trees that dotted the hills around the farm. "Are you hungry?" Thorfinn asked finally. "The journey from your village is long." Brida managed a small nod. She was always hungry, but she'd learned to eat sparingly, to take up as little space as possible in every way. Her stepmother had made sure she understood that every bite she took was a burden on the household. Thorfinn led her toward the house, his long stride shortened to match her pace. "I've prepared the main room for you," he said. "You'll have privacy. I sleep in the loft above the workshop." Privacy. The word was foreign to her. At home, she'd shared a cramped space with her younger half-siblings, always in the way, always taking up too much room. The idea that she might have space of her own seemed impossible. The inside of the farmhouse surprised her. It was clean, well-built, with thick wooden beams supporting the roof and a large stone hearth dominating one wall. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, and the scent of wood smoke and something cooking filled the air. It felt warm, lived in, cared for. "I'm not much of a cook," Thorfinn admitted, stirring something in a pot hung over the fire. "But it's hot, and it will fill you." As he ladled stew into a wooden bowl, Brida noticed how carefully he moved around the kitchen. His hands, so large they could probably crush stone, handled the bowls and spoons with delicate precision. When he set the food before her at the rough wooden table, he didn't hover or watch her eat. Instead, he busied himself banking the fire and tidying the already clean room. The stew was simple but good, meat and vegetables in a rich broth that warmed her from the inside. She ate slowly, waiting for some comment about her appetite, some disapproving look, but Thorfinn seemed focused on his own meal and his own thoughts. "The farm keeps me busy," he said eventually. "Sheep, mostly, and a few cattle. Some crops, though the growing season is short here. There's a vegetable garden behind the house, and I keep chickens." He paused, glancing at her. "I could use help with the household tasks, but I won't demand more than you're able to give." Brida looked up from her bowl, surprised by the consideration in his tone. "I can work," she said quietly. "I'm used to working." Something flickered across his face. Anger, perhaps, but not directed at her. "I'm sure you are," he said simply. After the meal, he showed her around the farmstead. The workshop where he slept was filled with tools and half-finished projects. She caught a glimpse of something covered by canvas in the corner, but didn't ask about it. The barn housed the animals he'd mentioned, and she was surprised to see how gently he handled them, how they seemed to trust him completely. "The nearest neighbors are half a day's ride," he explained as they walked the boundaries of his land. "We're quite isolated here. Some find it lonely." Brida looked out over the rolling hills, covered in heather and bracken, stretching toward distant mountains. The silence was profound, broken only by wind and the occasional call of a bird. After years of her father's household, crowded, loud, full of criticism and chaos, the peace felt like a blessing. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Thorfinn stopped walking and looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You think so?" "Yes." She touched a sprig of late-blooming heather. "It feels safe." That evening, as promised, he left her alone in the main room of the house while he retreated to his workshop loft. She had expected him to claim his marital rights immediately. Wasn't that why men took wives? But he simply banked the fire, wished her good night, and disappeared into his own space. Alone in the flickering firelight, Brida explored her new surroundings more thoroughly. The bed was large and well-made, with clean linens and warm furs. A wooden chest sat at its foot, empty and waiting for the few possessions she'd brought. There was even a small table with a basin and pitcher for washing. She pulled out her cracked mirror and looked at her reflection in the uncertain light. The same round face looked back at her, the same soft chin and worried eyes. Her brown hair hung limp and dull around her shoulders. She was exactly what she'd always been, too large, too plain, too much trouble, yet Thorfinn had shown her nothing but courtesy. As she prepared for bed, she heard him moving around in the workshop below the loft. There was a rhythmic sound, carving, perhaps, or some other craft. It was oddly comforting, knowing he was there but respecting her space. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling beams and trying to understand what had happened to her. She had been sold essentially to pay her father's debts. She was trapped in this remote place with a man she didn't know, a man whose reputation as a warrior had reached even her small village. Yet for the first time in years, she felt something other than shame. The next few days established a routine between them. Thorfinn rose before dawn to tend the animals and work the land. Brida took over the household tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending. She'd expected him to criticize her efforts, to find fault with her cooking or her housekeeping, but he simply thanked her for whatever she provided. They spoke little, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people learning to exist in the same space without friction. He was careful never to startle her with sudden movements, never to raise his voice, never to stand too close. She began to realize that this giant of a man was being extraordinarily gentle with her. One morning, she found him in the barn, treating a sheep with an injured leg. His massive hands worked with infinite patience, cleaning the wound and binding it with strips of clean cloth. The sheep stood calmly, as if it trusted him completely. "Will it heal?" she asked from the doorway. "With time and care," he replied, without looking up. "Most things do if they're given what they need." Something in his tone made her wonder if he was talking about more than just the sheep. That afternoon, as she worked in the vegetable garden, she noticed him watching her from across the yard, not staring, not leering, just observing with the same quiet attention he gave everything else on his farm. When their eyes met, he didn't look away in embarrassment or narrow his gaze in judgment. He simply nodded and returned to his work. Brida found herself studying him in return. Thorfinn moved with the economy of motion that came from years of physical labor, but there was something else there too, a wariness, a careful control that spoke of harder times. The scars on his hands and arms weren't from farm work alone. These were battle scars, wounds taken in violence she could barely imagine. Yet, with her, with his animals, with everything on this peaceful farm, he was nothing but gentle. As the days grew shorter and the highland autumn began to show its teeth, Brida found herself settling into this new life with surprising ease. The fear that had gripped her during the journey here was fading, replaced by something she barely recognized, a tentative sense of belonging. She still caught herself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Thorfinn's kindness to reveal itself as mere patience before cruelty, but each day that passed without harsh words or rough treatment made that fear seem less reasonable. One evening, as they shared their simple supper, she found the courage to ask the question that had been building in her mind. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" The words came out more bluntly than she'd intended. "You could have had anyone. Why me?" Thorfinn was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "I built this farm to be a home," he said, "but a home needs more than one person to make it whole. Your father's messenger said you were hard-working, honest, in need of a fresh start." He looked across the table at her. "So was I. But I'm not what most men would want." The anger that flickered across his features was swift and controlled, but she saw it nonetheless. "Most men are fools," he said quietly. "They wouldn't recognize worth if it stood before them dressed in silk." Brida felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from something else entirely. Something that might have been hope. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and promising the first real cold snap of the season. But inside the stone walls of Ravenshollow, for the first time in her life, Brida felt truly warm. The storm came without warning, as highland storms often do. Brida woke to the sound of wind howling around the farmhouse like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending rain against the windows in driving sheets. Through the grey morning light, she could see that the world outside had disappeared into a wall of water and mist. Thorfinn appeared in the doorway to the main room, his hair darkened with rain and his clothes soaked through. "The animals are secure," he said, pulling off his wet cloak, "but we'll be trapped inside for a few days. This one has the feel of a long blow." Brida nodded, trying not to notice how his wet shirt clung to the broad expanse of his chest and shoulders. In the weeks since her arrival, they had maintained their careful distance, their polite routines. Now they would be confined together in this small space with nowhere to retreat. The first day passed quietly enough. Thorfinn worked on small repairs inside the house, while Brida tended to household tasks. They moved around each other like dancers, careful not to come too close, speaking only when necessary. But by the second day, the forced proximity was creating a different kind of tension between them. "You don't have to hover near the wall when I'm in the room," Thorfinn said gently during their midday meal. "I won't hurt you, Brida." She looked up from her bowl, startled by his directness. "I know that. Do you?" His grey eyes searched her face. "You act like a rabbit ready to bolt every time I move too quickly." Heat rose in her cheeks. She had been doing exactly that, she realized, shrinking into herself whenever he was near, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. It was what she'd learned to do to survive in her father's house, but she could see how it might seem like fear of him specifically. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It's not you. It's just habit." Something dark flickered across his features. "What kind of household were you raised in, Brida?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. She had never spoken of her family to anyone, never put into words the daily humiliations and casual cruelties that had shaped her understanding of her place in the world. "The kind where I learned to stay out of the way," she said finally. Thorfinn was quiet for a long moment, his large hands wrapped around his eating bowl. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of understanding that surprised her. "My father believed that strength was the only virtue worth cultivating," he said. "Weakness was to be beaten out of a child like dross from heated metal. I learned early to hide anything that might be seen as soft." Brida looked at him with new eyes, seeing past the massive frame and scarred hands to something more vulnerable underneath. "Is that why you became a warrior?" "Among other reasons." He set down his bowl and leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly at the movement. "Your shoulder," she observed. "It pains you in the cold." Thorfinn glanced at her in surprise. "You're observant. You favor it when the weather turns, and sometimes at night I can hear you moving restlessly." She hesitated, then added, "I have some knowledge of healing. My mother taught me before. She died. Your mother was a healer. She tried to be. My father, he didn't approve. Said it was superstition, that it made her willful." Brida's hands tightened around her bowl. "After she died, he forbade me to practice what she'd taught me." The wind gusted against the house with renewed force, and something in the rhythm of it seemed to break down the walls they'd both built. Thorfinn shifted in his chair again, and this time the wince was unmistakable. "Let me help," Brida said, softly. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. "You don't have to. I want to." The words surprised her with their firmness. "Please." After another moment's hesitation, Thorfinn pulled his shirt over his head, revealing the source of his discomfort. A jagged scar ran from his left shoulder. A blade toward his spine, the tissue around it raised and angry-looking. But it was the freshly torn skin at the edge of the old wound that made Brida gasp. "You've reopened it," she said, moving closer before she could think to be afraid. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday, lifting the beam to reinforce the barn door." His voice was strained. "It's nothing serious." "It could become serious if it festers." Without thinking, she reached out to examine the wound, her fingers gentle, against his scarred skin. She felt him tense at the contact, but he didn't pull away. The injury was worse than he'd admitted. The old scar tissue had torn along its length, creating a wound that would need careful tending to heal properly. But it was the network of other scars covering his back and shoulders that made her breath catch, evidence of battles fought, of pain endured, of a life lived in violence she could barely comprehend. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, her fingertips tracing the edge of an old blade wound. "Many people, over many years." His voice was steady, but she could feel the tension in his muscles. "It's the price of the life I chose. No one should have to pay such a price." Thorfinn turned his head to look at her, and she realized how close she was standing, how intimate this moment had become. "No one should have to learn to make themselves small to avoid cruelty either," he said quietly. Their eyes met and held, and Brida felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of shared pain and mutual understanding. For the first time since her arrival, the careful distance they'd maintained seemed less like respect and more like fear. "I need to clean this wound," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, not breaking eye contact. "Do what you need to do." She gathered water and clean cloth, her hands steadier than she'd expected them to be. As she worked, carefully cleaning the torn skin and applying the healing salve her mother had taught her to make, they talked in low voices about things neither had shared before. Thorfinn told her about his early years of raiding, the gradual disillusionment with violence, the decision to leave that life behind and build something peaceful. She spoke of her childhood, of watching her gentle mother wither under her father's disapproval, of learning that her very existence was a burden others had to bear. "Your father was wrong," Thorfinn said, as she bound his wound with strips of clean linen. "You're not a burden, Brida. You're a gift he was too blind to see." She stilled at his words, her hands resting lightly on his bandaged shoulder. "You don't know me well enough to say that, don't I?" He turned in his chair to face her fully, his grey eyes serious. "In the weeks you've been here, you've brought life to this house. You've cared for everything you've touched, the garden, the animals, even me, though I've given you no reason to. You have a healer's heart, Brida. That's not a burden. It's a blessing." Tears pricked at her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of shame or sorrow. "I don't know how to believe that. Then I'll believe it for both of us," he said simply. "Until you can believe it for yourself." The storm raged outside, but something had quieted in the space between them. When Brida finished tending his wound, she didn't immediately step away. Instead, she let her hand rest on his uninjured shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palm. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with something deeper than gratitude. "Thank you," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. For his gentleness, perhaps, for seeing something in her that others had missed, for making her feel, for the first time in her life, that she might be worthy of kindness. That night, as the storm continued to howl around the farmhouse, Brida lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of Thorfinn moving around in his loft. The restless shifting was gone from his movements. The wound properly tended, he seemed to be resting more comfortably. But she found herself restless now, replaying the moment when she'd touched his scarred skin, when he'd looked at her with something that might have been wonder. The careful walls they'd built between them had cracked today, letting in light neither had expected. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Inside, something new was beginning to grow in the warm space between two wounded souls, learning to trust again. The storm passed on the third day, leaving the highland landscape washed clean and glittering under pale autumn sunlight. But the change it had wrought between Thorfinn and Brida lingered like morning mist, present, transformative, but still fragile enough to disappear at the wrong word or gesture. Brida found herself taking small initiatives she would never have dared before. When she noticed Thorfinn favoring his injured shoulder as he worked to repair storm damage, She quietly prepared a fresh batch of healing salve without being asked. When she saw him struggling to reach something on a high shelf, with his limited mobility, she simply moved to help, no longer afraid that her presence might be unwelcome. "The wound is healing well," she observed one morning as she changed his bandages. Her hands had grown steady with practice, no longer trembling at the intimacy of touching him. "Thanks to your skill," Thorfinn replied, watching her work with something that might have been admiration. "Where did you learn to bind wounds so expertly?" Brida's hands stilled for a moment. "My mother. She said healing was a gift that should never be wasted, even when others didn't understand its value." She secured the bandage and stepped back. "I used to tend injured animals in secret after she died. My father thought it was foolish, but I couldn't bear to watch anything suffer when I might help it." "Like the lamb with the injured leg," Thorfinn said quietly. "I watched you with it yesterday. You have the same gentleness your mother must have had." The comparison to her mother, the only person who had ever shown Brida unconditional love, brought tears to her eyes. She turned away quickly, busying herself with putting away the medical supplies, but Thorfinn's large hand settled gently on her shoulder. "I didn't mean to distress you," he said. "You didn't." She looked back at him, surprised by her own honesty. "It's just been so long since anyone thought I had something worth praising." His fingers tightened slightly on her shoulder, not possessive, but protective. Then they were blind fools, all of them. That afternoon, Brida attempted something she hadn't dared try since her mother's death. She gathered herbs from the garden and the surrounding hillsides, combining them into the traditional remedies her mother had taught her. The familiar motions of drying, grinding, and mixing brought back memories of working beside her mother in their tiny kitchen, learning the old ways that connected them to generations of healers. When Thorfinn came in from the fields, he found her surrounded by small bundles of herbs and clay pots filled with various preparations. The air was rich with the scents of chamomile, yarrow, and the dozen other plants she'd been working with. "It smells like a healer's workshop in here," he said, his tone carrying approval rather than criticism. "I thought, that is, winter will be here soon, and if either of us should fall ill—" She stumbled over the words, suddenly uncertain. "I could prepare some basic remedies if you don't object." "Object?" Thorfinn moved closer, examining the neat rows of preparations with obvious interest. "Brida, this is remarkable work. You've created more useful medicine in one afternoon than most healers manage in a week." She ducked her head, unused to such praise. "It's nothing special, just what my mother taught me. Your mother taught you well." He picked up one of the small clay pots, examining the contents. "What is this one for?" "Pain relief. For joints and muscles." She hesitated, then added, "I made it specifically for your shoulder, though I suppose it could help with other ailments as well." When he looked at her, his grey eyes held an expression she was beginning to recognize, a mixture of gratitude, wonder, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly. "Every day I discover something new about the remarkable woman I married." Heat flooded her cheeks at his words. "I'm not remarkable, I'm just what?" His voice was gentle but firm. "Just intelligent, just skilled, just kind enough to spend your day preparing medicines to help others. Just brave enough to practice healing arts your father forbade." He set down the pot and turned to face her fully. "Brida, you are many things, but just anything is not one of them." That evening, as they shared their supper, Brida found herself speaking more freely than she had since her arrival. She told him about the animals she had secretly treated as a child, the satisfaction of watching a bird she'd mended take flight again, the joy of seeing her remedies ease someone's pain. "I always imagined having my own healing practice someday," she admitted, then caught herself. "Not that I'm unhappy here, I didn't mean, why couldn't you have a healing practice here?" Thorfinn interrupted. She stared at him. Here, the nearest healer lives more than a day's ride away. People in the surrounding farms often have to travel great distances for medical care, especially in winter. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. If you're willing, there would certainly be need for your skills. The idea was so foreign to Brida that she could hardly process it. You would allow that? Allow it? Thorfinn looked genuinely puzzled. Brida, you're not my possession. You're my wife, my partner. If healing brings you joy and helps our neighbors, why wouldn't I support it? That night, Brida lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. A healing practice of her own. The chance to use the skills her mother had taught her openly, proudly. The opportunity to help people, instead of hiding her abilities in shame. The next morning, she woke to find a wooden crate by the door, filled with various containers and small tools. Thorfinn was already outside working, but when she caught up with him by the barn, her questioning look made him pause in his tasks. For your medicines, he explained simply. I thought you might need proper storage. You made these? She examined the beautifully crafted containers, each one perfectly sized for different types of preparations. I enjoy woodworking. It gives me something to do with my hands during the long evenings. He seemed almost embarrassed by her obvious delight. They're nothing special. They're perfect. She turned one of the containers over in her hands, admiring the smooth finish and clever design. No one has ever made anything just for me before. Then I'll have to make you many more things, he said quietly. As the days grew shorter and the Highland autumn showed its full glory, Brida found herself settling into her new role with growing confidence. Word of her healing skills began to spread among the scattered farm families in the area, and she found herself treating everything from children's fevers to elderly joints stiff with age. Each time someone thanked her for her help, each time she saw relief replace pain in a patient's eyes, she felt a little more of her old shame fall away. She was useful here, she was valued. She was becoming the woman her mother had always believed she could be. And Thorfinn, quiet, gentle Thorfinn, watched it all with obvious pride, supporting her work in countless small ways, never once suggesting that her growing reputation reflected poorly on him or their household. One evening, as they worked together in comfortable silence, she preparing her medicines, he carving new containers for her supplies, Brida realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful politeness was still there, but underneath it was growing something warmer, more genuine. She was no longer afraid of this giant of a man. More surprisingly, she was beginning to believe that he truly saw her as something other than a burden to be borne. For the first time in her life, Brida was beginning to understand what it might feel like to be valued for who she was rather than apologizing for who she wasn't. The mirror broke on a Tuesday morning, shattering against the stone floor with a sound like brittle laughter. Brida stared at the fragments scattered around her feet, her own reflection fractured into a dozen distorted pieces. She'd been reaching for it when her elbow caught the edge, sending her mother's last gift tumbling to destruction. No, she whispered, dropping to her knees among the shards. This mirror had been the one thing of value she'd brought from her old life, the only physical connection to her mother's memory. Her hand shook as she tried to gather the pieces, cutting her finger on a sharp edge. Brida? Thorfinn's voice came from the doorway, filled with concern. I heard something break. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, holding a piece of silvered glass that reflected nothing but fractured light. It was my mother's, she managed. It was all I had left of her. Thorfinn knelt beside her carefully, his large hands gently taking the glass from her trembling fingers before she could cut herself further. Let me, he said softly, beginning to collect the scattered pieces with infinite patience. It's ruined, Brida said, her voice thick with grief that seemed too large for one broken mirror. Just like everything else I touch. Nothing you touch is ruined. Thorfinn's voice was firm as he gathered the last of the fragments. Look at me, Brida. She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing her own pain reflected in their grey depths. This mirror was just glass and silver, he said gently. Your mother's real gift to you wasn't something you could see in a reflection. It was her knowledge, her kindness, her healing touch. Those things live in you, and no amount of broken glass can destroy them. But I'm not like her, Brida protested. She was beautiful, graceful, everything I'm not. This mirror was the only proof I had that we were connected. Thorfinn was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands carefully wrapping the mirror fragments in a piece of cloth. When he spoke again, his voice held a gentleness that seemed to reach directly into her wounded heart. Would you like to know what I see when I look at you? He asked. Brida shook her head instinctively. She'd heard enough assessments of her appearance to last several lifetimes. I see a woman who tends injured animals with the same care she'd give to her own child. I see hands that can ease pain and create healing where there was suffering. I see someone who works from dawn to dusk without complaint, who has brought warmth and life to this house. He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. I see someone who is so much more than she believes herself to be. You're just being kind, Brida said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I'm being truthful. Thorfinn stood slowly, extending his hand to help her up. Your worth isn't determined by your reflection in a piece of glass, Brida. It's determined by who you are, what you do, how you treat others, and by those measures, you are remarkable. Later that evening, as they shared their supper, Brida found herself studying Thorfinn's face in the firelight. He ate with careful attention to his food, but she caught him glancing at her with obvious concern. I'm sorry about this morning, she said finally. I didn't mean to fall apart over something so trivial. It wasn't trivial. It was important to you, which makes it important. He set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair. We all have things that anchor us to who we used to be, who we loved. When we lose them, it feels like losing pieces of ourselves. What anchors you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Thorfinn was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. When he returned, he carried something small wrapped in soft leather. This, he said, unwrapping a worn gold ring. It was my father's, and his father's before him. The only thing I kept from my old life when I came here. Brida examined the ring, noting the simple but elegant design, the way it caught the firelight. Why didn't you keep more? Because I wanted to become someone new, someone better than the man I'd been. He took the ring back, turning it over in his large fingers. But this ring reminds me that even the hardest men can change if they choose to. My father was cruel, but he wasn't always that way. His father told stories of when he was young, before the world hardened him. Do you think people can really change? Brida asked. I think we have to believe they can, or there's no hope for any of us. Thorfinn slipped the ring back into its leather wrapping. I used to be a man who solved problems with violence. Now I'm learning to solve them with patience, with understanding. You used to be a woman who believed she was worthless. But every day I see you discovering your own value. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Brida felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of some tight knot she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. I made something today, she said quietly, while you were working the far field. She rose and brought back a small loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. But this wasn't the dense, practical bread she usually made. This was shaped like a braided wreath, golden and aromatic with herbs. My mother used to make these for celebrations, she explained, suddenly shy. I haven't attempted one since she died. I thought perhaps... She stopped, uncertain. It's beautiful, Thorfinn said, and she could hear genuine appreciation in his voice. What are we celebrating? I don't know exactly. Brida sat back down, smoothing her skirts nervously. New beginnings, perhaps. Or maybe just the fact that for the first time in years, I wanted to make something beautiful instead of merely functional. Thorfinn broke off a piece of the bread and tasted it, his eyes closing briefly in appreciation. Your mother would be proud. They shared the celebration bread in comfortable silence, and when a piece crumbled in Brida's lap, she began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, but built into something deeper, richer, genuine mirth that seemed to surprise them. Both. What's amusing? Thorfinn asked, but he was smiling too. I was just thinking. Here we are eating fancy bread to celebrate I don't know what, and I'm covered in crumbs like a child. She gestured at her flour-dusted apron, her hair that had escaped its braid during the day's work. I must look ridiculous. You look happy, Thorfinn said simply. It suits you. The compliment warmed her more than the fire at her back. When was the last time someone had told her she looked happy? When was the last time she had actually felt happy? Thank you, she said softly, for today, for every day since I arrived here, for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. I could say the same to you. Thorfinn's voice was rough with emotion. You've brought life to this place, Brida. Before you came, I was just existing here, going through the motions of living. Now... He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. Now it feels like a home. That night, as Brida prepared for bed, she realized she no longer missed the broken mirror. Without its critical reflection to confront each morning, she was beginning to see herself through different eyes. Thorfinn's eyes perhaps, or maybe her mother's. She was still the same woman, carrying the same body, but something fundamental had changed in how she inhabited that body, how she moved through the world. She was still too large by her father's standards, still plain by the village's measure of beauty. But she was also skilled, kind, useful, valued. She was a healer, a partner, a woman who could make celebration bread on a Tuesday afternoon just because she wanted to create something beautiful. For the first time in her adult life, when Brida closed her eyes that night, she wasn't mentally cataloguing her failures and inadequacies. Instead, she was thinking about tomorrow's possibilities, what she might accomplish, what she might discover about herself, how she might continue to grow into the woman Thorfinn seemed to believe she already was. In the workshop loft below, she could hear him moving around, but tonight the sounds weren't restless. They were purposeful, creative, the sounds of a man who had found peace in his chosen life. Two broken people, she thought drowsily, learning to be whole together. It wasn't the beginning of their story, but it was perhaps the end of the beginning, the moment when they stopped being two separate souls sharing space and started becoming something new together. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the island farm in pristine snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and strange. Brida woke one morning to find the world outside her window gleaming white and silent, the mountains in the distance sharp-edged against a pearl-grey sky. She found Thorfinn in his workshop, bent over his workbench with the focused concentration she'd come to recognize. Wood shavings curled around his feet, and the air smelled of pine and the linseed oil he used to finish his pieces. "What are you making?" she asked, moving closer to examine his work. Thorfinn's hands stilled on his carving. "Knife," and she saw the faintest hint of color rise in his weathered cheeks. "It's nothing important," he said, but his body language suggested otherwise. Brida moved around the workbench to get a better view, and her breath caught. In his large, scarred hands, Thorfinn held a small wooden bird, no bigger than her palm. Every feather was carefully detailed, every curve of wing and beak rendered with exquisite precision. It was beautiful, delicate and perfect in a way that seemed impossible from hands that had once wielded weapons of war. "It's for you," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. I know it's not much, but I thought, that is, you seem to enjoy the birds that come to the garden, and I wanted to give you something that wouldn't break, like—" He stopped, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to form. "Like the mirror," Brida finished softly, understanding flooding through her. "Yes." He held out the carved bird, his expression uncertain. "If you don't like it, I can make something else." Brida took the wooden bird in her cupped palms, marveling at its weightless beauty. No one had ever given her a gift simply because they wanted to bring her joy. No one had ever spent hours creating something meant just for her. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned," she said, and meant it. Completely. The relief that crossed Thorfinn's face was almost painful to witness. "You truly like it?" "I love it." She looked up at him, this gentle giant who had somehow seen past her shame to something worth cherishing. "No one has ever made me anything before." "Then I'll make you many more things," he said, echoing his earlier promise about the medicine containers. But this time his voice carried a different weight, not just courtesy or kindness, but something deeper. That afternoon, as snow continued to fall outside, they found themselves sitting closer together, by the fire than they ever had before. Brida held the wooden bird in her hands, running her fingers over its smooth surface, while Thorfinn worked on mending a harness. "Why a bird?" she asked. Thorfinn glanced up from his work. "You watch them," he said simply. "Every morning when you tend the garden, you stop to watch the birds feeding. You smile when you see them." He paused, his hands still on the leather. "I wanted to capture that for you. Something that would make you smile even when the birds have flown south for winter." The simple honesty of his observation moved her more than flowery poetry could have. He had watched her, noticed what brought her small moments of joy, and spent his evenings creating something to extend that happiness. "Thorfinn," she said softly, and something in her tone made him look up sharply. She stopped, struggling with words that had never come easily to her. "I care for you, more than I expected to when I first came here." The harness fell forgotten from his hands. "Brida, I don't know if what I feel is what other wives feel for their husbands," she continued, her courage building with each word. "I've never had anyone to compare it to, but when I see you in pain, I hurt too. When you smile at something I've done, I feel warm all over. When you're working in the far field and I can't see you, I worry until you come back." Thorfinn set aside his work entirely and turned to face her fully. In the firelight, his grey eyes seemed to hold depths she'd never noticed before. "And when I watch you healing someone," he said quietly, "when I see the gentle way you handle injured creatures, when you laugh at something simple and beautiful, I think my heart might burst from pride. Not pride in owning you, but pride in knowing you, in being chosen by you." "Chosen," Brida repeated, puzzled. "You could have remained cold and distant. You could have done only what was required and no more. Instead, you chose to build a life, here with me. Chose to care for this place, for the animals, for me." His voice grew rough with emotion. "That choice means more to me than you could possibly know." They sat looking at each other across the small space between their chairs, the air thick with unspoken feelings and possibilities. Then Thorfinn rose slowly and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so their faces were level. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering near her cheek. Brida nodded, not trusting her voice. When his palm settled against her face, warm and gentle, she leaned into the touch like a flower turning towards sunlight. "I never thought I could have this," he whispered. "A wife who cares for me, a home filled with peace instead of conflict. You've given me things I didn't even know I was missing." "You saved me," Brida replied, her own hand coming up to cover his. "From my father's house, from a life of shame and loneliness. But more than that, you helped me save myself. When Thorfinn..." leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers. It was nothing like the brutal kisses she'd heard other women whisper about. It was gentle, questioning, full of respect and growing love. When she kissed him back, tentatively at first, and then, with increasing confidence, she felt something settle into place in her chest, a rightness she'd never experienced before. They spent that evening talking by the fire, sharing memories and dreams with an intimacy that went far beyond the physical. Thorfinn told her about the family he'd imagined having someday, children who would know safety and love instead of violence and fear. Brida spoke of her mother's garden, of the healing practice she was beginning to build, of the future she was learning to hope for. When it came time to retire, they stood facing each other with new awareness crackling between them. The careful boundaries they'd maintained since her arrival seemed suddenly artificial, barriers that no longer served any purpose. "Brida," Thorfinn said softly, "if you'd like, that is, if you're comfortable with the idea, you don't have to sleep alone anymore." She looked into his eyes and saw no demand there, no expectation of rights claimed, only an invitation, freely given, that she was equally free to accept or decline. "I'd like that," she said simply. That night, for the first time since her arrival, at Ravenshollow, Brida fell asleep in her husband's arms. His body was warm and solid against her back, his breathing steady and peaceful. The wooden bird sat on the bedside table, where she could see it in the moonlight streaming through the window, a symbol of unexpected beauty, careful craftsmanship, and the growing love of a man who saw her as she truly was. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their small world in pristine silence. But inside the stone walls of their home, two hearts that had known too much loneliness were finally learning what it meant to belong to someone who cherished them completely. Spring came to the highlands like a whispered promise, tentative at first, then growing bolder with each passing day. The snow retreated from the valleys first, revealing patches of brown earth that would soon burst into green. Brida stood at the kitchen window, watching the icicles that hung from the eaves drip steadily in the warming sun, and felt a corresponding thaw in her own heart. The months of winter had changed everything between her and Thorfinn. What had begun as careful courtesy had deepened into genuine partnership, then into something that felt remarkably like love. They moved through their daily routines with the easy synchronization of two people who had learned each other's rhythms, who anticipated each other's needs without conscious thought. But this morning was different. This morning, Brida had awakened with a familiar queasiness that brought back memories of watching her stepmother through multiple pregnancies. She'd said nothing to Thorfinn yet, wanting to be certain, but as she watched him splitting wood outside the kitchen window, she allowed herself to imagine telling him the news. "You're quiet today," Thorfinn observed when he came in for the midday meal, his cheeks flushed from the cool air and physical exertion. "Just thinking," Brida replied, ladling stew into his bowl. The smell of it, usually appealing, made her stomach turn slightly. Thorfinn studied her face with the attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. "Are you feeling well? You look pale." "I'm fine," she said quickly, then reconsidered. They had built their relationship on honesty, on sharing both joys and concerns. "Actually, I think I might be. That is, I believe I may be carrying our child." The wooden spoon fell from Thorfinn's hand, clattering against the table. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his grey eyes wide with something between shock and wonder. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not entirely, but the signs are there." Brida sat down across from him, her own hands trembling slightly. "Are you pleased?" Instead of answering with words, Thorfinn rose from his chair and came around the table, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. He held her as if she were made of the finest glass, his large hands spanning her back, his face buried in her hair. "Pleased," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Brida, I never dared to hope. I mean, I dreamed of it, but I never thought it would truly happen." "It's still early," she cautioned, but she couldn't keep the smile from her voice. "Things can go wrong." "They won't." Thorfinn pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "Not with you caring for yourself. Not with both of us wanting this child so much." That afternoon, Thorfinn disappeared into his workshop for several hours. When he emerged, he carried a small object wrapped in soft cloth. His expression was almost shy as he approached her. "This belonged to my mother," he said, unwrapping what proved to be a delicate pendant on a silver chain. The pendant itself was a piece of carved amber, warm and golden, with what looked like a tiny flower preserved in its heart. She wore it through all her pregnancies. Her mother gave it to her, and her grandmother before that. Brida touched the amber reverently, feeling the weight of generations in the simple piece of jewelry. "Are you sure you want me to have it?" "I've been saving it for the woman who would bear my children," Thorfinn said simply. "There's no one else I would rather give it to." As he fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers gentle against her nape, Brida felt the full impact of what was happening. She wasn't just carrying Thorfinn's child, she was continuing his family line, becoming part of a heritage that stretched back generations. The amber pendant settled against her chest like a warm promise, a tangible link to the women who had come before her. "Tell me about her," Brida said softly. "Your mother." Thorfinn's hands stilled for a moment before he finished with the clasp. "She was kind, like you, gentle with injured things. She tried to teach me and my brothers that strength didn't have, to mean cruelty, though my father's lessons usually drowned hers out." He moved to sit beside her on the bed. "She would have loved you, would have been so proud to see you wearing her pendant." "What was her name?" "Astrid." Thorfinn smiled at the memory. "She used to sing while she worked. Old songs her grandmother had taught her, lullabies and healing chants. I haven't thought about those songs in years. Maybe you could teach them to our child," Brida suggested. The idea seemed to strike Thorfinn like a physical blow. "Our child," he repeated wonderingly. "I can barely believe it's real." "It's real," Brida assured him, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat belly. "By late autumn we'll be holding our son or daughter." "What do you hope for?" Thorfinn asked. "A son or daughter?" Brida considered the question seriously. "A healthy child who knows love from the first moment of life. Beyond that, I don't care." She paused, then added quietly, "Though I confess the idea of a daughter terrifies me." "Why? What if she looks like me? What if the world treats her the way it treated me?" The old fears rose in her throat like bile. "What if I can't protect her from the cruelty I experienced?" Thorfinn's hands tightened over hers. "Our daughter, if we have one, will be raised knowing her own worth. She'll be taught that her value comes from her character, her kindness, her intelligence, not from meeting someone else's narrow definition of beauty." His voice grew fierce with protective love. "And anyone who dares to treat our child with cruelty will answer to me." The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that their child would be cherished and protected, eased something in Brida's chest that she hadn't even realized was tight with anxiety. As the weeks passed and spring established itself more firmly, the reality of the pregnancy became undeniable. Brida's body began to change in small but noticeable ways, and with each change came a corresponding shift in how Thorfinn treated her. He was already gentle, but now he became almost reverentially careful, insisting on taking over the heavier household tasks, bringing her special foods he thought might help with her morning sickness. "You don't have to treat me like an invalid," she protested one morning when he insisted on carrying a basket of laundry that she could easily have managed herself. I know you're strong, he replied, taking the basket anyway. But you're carrying our child now. Let me take care of both of you. The neighboring farm families began to notice the change in Brida as well. Women who had been merely polite before started offering advice about pregnancy and childbirth, sharing stories of their own experiences. For the first time since leaving her father's house, Brida felt like she belonged to a community of women united by the common experience of bringing life into the world. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Brida mending clothes while Thorfinn worked on what appeared to be a small wooden cradle, she voiced a thought that had been growing in her mind. "By spring we'll meet our son," she said softly, echoing words that had become a kind of prayer between them. Thorfinn looked up from his carving, his eyes warm with love and anticipation. "By spring," he agreed, "our family will be complete." Outside, the highland wind carried the scent of blooming heather and the promise of longer days ahead. Inside their stone house, two people who had found love in each other's brokenness prepared to create new life, new hope, new possibilities for healing the wounds of the past. The amber pendant caught the firelight as Brida moved, a golden reminder that some promises were worth keeping, some loves worth believing in, and some dreams worth hoping for, even when hope itself had once seemed impossible. They came with the early summer mist, materializing from the highland fog like ghosts made flesh. Brida first spotted them from the kitchen window. 3 riders approaching the farm at a steady pace, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. Something about the way they moved, the purposeful set of their shoulders, made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. "Thorfinn!" she called, her voice tight with anxiety. He appeared in the doorway, took one look at her expression, and moved immediately to the window. When he saw the riders, every muscle in his body went still in a way that reminded Brida suddenly and vividly that her gentle husband had once been something far more dangerous. "Get into the root cellar," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority she'd never heard before. "Stay there until I come for you." "Who are they?" Brida asked, though part of her already knew. These weren't neighbors coming to visit or traders seeking supplies. These men carried themselves like predators, like violence barely contained. "Men from my past," Thorfinn replied, moving to a wooden chest she'd never seen him open. From it, he withdrew something that made her blood run cold, a battle axe. Its head darkened with age and use, its handle worn smooth by hands that had wielded it in deadly earnest. "Men I hoped never to see again." The riders had reached the yard now, and their leader, a man with iron-grey hair and scars that made Thorfinn's look decorative, dismounted with fluid grace. Even from the window, Brida could see the cold calculation in his pale eyes, the way he assessed their home like a wolf measuring prey. "Thorfinn Eriksson," the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "The phantom himself, playing at farmer, how the mighty have fallen." Thorfinn stepped outside, the axe held loosely at his side but ready to be raised in an instant. Brida pressed herself against the window frame, her heart hammering as she watched her husband transform before her eyes. Gone was the gentle giant who carved wooden birds and worried about her morning sickness. In his place stood something cold and lethal, a reminder of the warrior he'd once been. "Magnus," Thorfinn acknowledged, his tone neutral but not welcoming. "What brings you to my home?" "Your home?" Magnus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "This little farm, these tame sheep, this is what the greatest raider of our generation has reduced himself to?" "I chose this life," Thorfinn replied evenly, "just as you chose to continue the old ways." "Chose?" Magnus stepped closer, and Brida could see the contempt written across his weathered features. "You abandoned your brother's phantom, turned your back on everything we built together, and for what? To play house with some farmer's fat daughter?" The insult hit Brida like a physical blow, but what terrified her more was the way Thorfinn's grip tightened on his axe handle. For a moment, she thought he might actually strike the man down where he stood. "Watch your tongue, Magnus," Thorfinn said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're a guest here, but my hospitality has limits." Magnus grinned, clearly delighted to have found a nerve to prod. "Ah, so the wolf does still have teeth. Good, because I have a proposition for you, old friend." "I'm no longer interested in your propositions. Not even when this one could set you up for life, not even when it could secure your precious little farm against any future threats." Magnus gestured to his companions, both of whom looked like they could kill a man with their bare hands. "The monastery at Kilmorgan is holding something very valuable, Thorfinn. Something that belongs to our people by right of conquest. One last raid, one final strike, and we all retire wealthy men." "No." Thorfinn's response was immediate and absolute. "Find someone else for your schemes, Magnus. I'm done with that life." "Ah, you?" Magnus's eyes glittered with malice. "Because that life isn't necessarily done with you. Word of your location has spread, Phantom. There are men who remember the villages you burned, the ships you sank, the brothers you killed in battle. Some of them are very interested in settling old scores." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Brida saw Thorfinn's shoulders tense. Imperceptibly, this was what he'd been running from, she realized. Not just his own violent past, but the enemies that past had created. "What are you saying, Magnus?" "I'm saying that you have a choice. Join us for this one last raid. Take your share of the spoils, and I'll make sure word spreads that Thorfinn Eriksson died in the taking of Kilmorgan. Your enemies will stop looking for you, and you can live out your peaceful little fantasy undisturbed." Magnus smiled like a shark scenting blood. "Or refuse, and I'll make sure every warrior with a grudge against the Phantom knows exactly where to find you. How long do you think your pregnant wife will survive when they come calling?" Brida's hand flew instinctively to her belly, to the life growing there that had given her such hope. The casual way Magnus spoke of her death, of threats to their unborn child, made her feel sick with more than morning nausea. "You would threaten an innocent woman?" Thorfinn's voice had dropped to a whisper, but somehow it carried more menace than any shout. "I would do whatever necessary to secure your cooperation, old friend, just as you once would have done." Magnus stepped back, clearly enjoying the power he held. "Think about it, Phantom. One last raid to secure the future, or watch everything you've built here burn to ash. You have 3 days to decide." The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and the lingering scent of violence in the morning air. Thorfinn stood motionless in the yard for a long moment, his knuckles white around the axe handle, before slowly lowering the weapon and returning to the house. Brida met him at the door, her face pale but determined. "I heard everything." "Then you know what's at stake." Thorfinn set the axe carefully against the wall, his movements controlled but tense. "I'm sorry, Brida. I'm sorry my past has followed me here." "Who were you?" she asked quietly. "Before you came to this place, before you became the man I married, who were you?" Thorfinn sank into his chair by the cold hearth, suddenly looking every one of his years and more. "I was death," he said simply. "I was the nightmare that coastal villages whispered about in their prayers. I was the Phantom, the raider who struck without warning and vanished without trace, leaving only corpses and burning buildings behind." The words hung between them like a blade, sharp with truth and edged with regret. Brida felt as though she was seeing her husband clearly for the first time, understanding the careful control he exercised over his massive frame, the gentle way he handled everything he touched. "How many?" she whispered. "Too many to count, too many to forget." Thorfinn looked up at her, his grey eyes haunted. "I told myself I was a warrior, that what I did was honourable. But warriors fight other warriors, Brida. What I did, what we did, it was slaughter. But you stopped. I stopped because I grew tired of being a monster, because I wanted to be something better than what my father raised me to be. He reached for her hand, his voice breaking slightly. I built this farm to be a sanctuary, Brida, a place where I could prove to myself that these hands could create instead of destroy. And you, God help me, you were supposed to be safe here. You and our child were supposed to be beyond the reach of what I used to be. Brida knelt beside his chair, taking his scarred hands in both of hers. You are not the same man who did those things, aren't I? Thorfinn's laugh was bitter. You saw how quickly I reached for that axe, how easily I slipped back into old patterns. The monster is still here, Brida. It's just been sleeping. Then don't wake it, she said fiercely. Find another way. There has to be another way. Magnus is right about one thing. My enemies will never stop looking for me. If I refuse his offer, if I don't give them a believable death to mourn, they'll keep coming. And eventually, they'll find us. He squeezed her hands gently. I won't. Let that happen to you, to our child. So what will you do? Thorfinn was quiet for a long moment, staring into the cold ashes of the previous night's fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. I'll do what I have to do to protect you, even if it means becoming the monster again, just one more time. Outside, the highland wind carried the scent of summer flowers and the promise of harvest time. But inside their stone house, Brida held her husband's hands and felt winter settling into her heart, cold and dark and full of fears she couldn't name. The 3 days that followed Magnus's visit passed like a fever dream, each hour weighted with decisions that could reshape their entire future. Thorfinn moved through his daily routines with mechanical precision, but Brida could see the war being fought behind his eyes. The gentle man he'd become battling against the violent past that refused to stay buried. On the first night, she found him standing in his workshop, staring at the battle axe he'd propped against the wall. The weapon seemed to radiate menace even in the lamplight, its dark metal head scarred from countless battles, its wooden handle worn smooth by hands that had dealt death without mercy. There has to be another way, Brida said from the doorway, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her growing belly. We could leave, find somewhere else to start over. Where? Thorfinn's voice was hollow with exhaustion. How far would we have to run, Brida? How many times would we have to start over before the past finally caught up with us? He turned to face her, his grey eyes haunted. And what kind of life would that be for our child? Always running, always hiding, always looking over our shoulders? Better than the life we'd have if you become a killer again. The words hung between them like an accusation, and Thorfinn flinched as if she'd struck him. Do you think I want this? Do you think any part of me wants to pick up that axe again? I think you're terrified, Brida replied, moving closer to him. I think you're so afraid of losing what we've built here that you're willing to destroy yourself to protect it. If I don't do this, Magnus will make good on his threat. You know he will. And if you do it, what then? You think you can just come home and pretend nothing's changed? You think you can wash the blood off your hands and go back to carving wooden birds and tending sheep? Brida's voice broke slightly. You think I'll be able to look at you the same way, knowing what you've done? The question hit Thorfinn like a physical blow, and for a moment he seemed to crumple under the weight of it. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. No. I know I can't come back from this unchanged. I know that if I do what Magnus wants, I'll lose pieces of myself that I can never get back. He looked at her with desperate love. But I also know that if I don't do it, I'll lose you. And I can't. I won't let that happen. The second day brought rain, a steady highland drizzle that turned the world grey and cheerless. Brida spent the morning working in her herb garden, trying to find peace in the familiar motions of tending growing things. But every time she looked toward the workshop where Thorfinn was supposed to be working, she saw him instead standing motionless in the yard, staring toward the mountains as if he could see his enemies approaching through the mist. That afternoon, he disappeared entirely, returning only as the sun was setting with mud on his boots and something like resolution in his eyes. He found Brida in the kitchen, where she was attempting to prepare their evening meal despite the nausea that had been plaguing her more severely in recent days. "I've been to see Father Duncan at the monastery," he said without preamble. Brida looked up sharply. "The one Magnus wants to raid?" "The same." Thorfinn sat heavily at their table, his expression grim but thoughtful. "I wanted to warn them, to give them a chance to prepare defenses or hide their treasures. But when I spoke with Duncan—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "What did he say?" "He said he'd been expecting me. Said he'd heard rumors that Magnus was gathering men for a raid, and he knew it was only a matter of time before someone came to warn them or scout their defenses." Thorfinn's hands clenched on the table. "He offered me sanctuary, Brida, for both of us. He said the church would protect us from my enemies if I helped them prepare for Magnus's attack." Hope flared in Brida's chest like a sudden flame. "That's a wonderful—" "No." Thorfinn's voice cut through her rising optimism. "It's not that simple. Duncan is a good man, but he's naive about the kind of violence Magnus can bring to bear. The monastery's walls might hold off bandits or opportunistic raiders, but Magnus isn't leading farmers with pitchforks. These are professional killers, men who've spent their lives perfecting the art of taking what they want. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Magnus will take that monastery, whether I help him or not. The only question is, how many innocents would die in the process?" Thorfinn stood and began pacing the small kitchen like a caged wolf. "If I'm there, if I'm part of the raid, I can control how it unfolds. I can make sure it's quick, clean, that the monks aren't slaughtered unnecessarily." "Listen to yourself," Brida said, rising to face him. "You're talking about participating in a raid on a holy place, about helping to steal from men who've taken vows of poverty and service, and you're calling it mercy." "Because it is." Thorfinn's voice rose, and for a moment she saw a flash of the violent man he'd once been. "You don't know Magnus like I do. Left to his own devices, he'll burn that monastery to the ground and everyone in it. At least if I'm there. If you're there, you become complicit in whatever happens. You become the monster again, no matter how you justify it to yourself." They stared at each other across the kitchen table, both breathing hard, both terrified of the future that seemed to be rushing toward them like an avalanche. Finally, Thorfinn sank back into his chair, all the fight going out of him at once. "What would you have me do, Brida? Tell me what choice I have that doesn't end with you and our child dead." The despair in his voice broke something inside her. She moved around the table and knelt beside his chair, taking his scarred hands in both of hers. "I would have you trust," she said softly. "Trust that we're stronger together than Magnus thinks. Trust that there are other ways to fight than with axes and bloodshed. Trust that the man you've become is worth more than the man you used to be. And if I'm wrong, if trust isn't enough, then we face whatever comes together, as partners, as equals." She squeezed his hands tightly. "But we don't surrender who we are out of fear of what might happen." The third day dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the grass and a bite in the air that promised autumn's approach. Brida woke to find Thorfinn's side of the bed empty, and for a moment panic seized her. Had he left already? Had he made his decision without telling her? She found him in the workshop, but not preparing for violence. Instead, he sat at his workbench, with a small bundle of soft wool in his hands, working with the same careful attention he'd given to carving her wooden bird. As she drew closer, she realized what he was making. A tiny blanket for their coming child, each stitch placed with infinite care and love. "You didn't sleep," she observed, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw... He shook his head, setting aside the baby blanket. I kept thinking about our child, about the world we're bringing them into. What kind of father will I be if I go back to killing? What kind of man? The same man who sits up all night making blankets for a baby who won't be born for months yet, Brida said gently. The same man who carved me a wooden bird just to see me smile. The same man who built this farm as a sanctuary for anyone who needed healing. But what if it's not enough? What if love and good intentions can't protect the people I care about? Before Brida could answer, the sound of approaching horses reached them from outside. Through the workshop window, they could see Magnus and his companions riding up the path, their faces set with grim purpose. "Time's up, Phantom," Magnus called as he dismounted. "What's your decision?" Thorfinn stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the battle axe that still leaned against the wall. For a moment, Brida thought he would reach for it, would surrender to the violence that had once defined him. Instead, he moved to stand in front of her, placing his large frame between her and Magnus's cold stare. "My decision is no," Thorfinn said clearly. "Find another way to wealth, Magnus. I won't be part of your raid." Magnus's expression darkened with genuine anger. "You're making a mistake, old friend. A fatal one." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." "And what about her?" Magnus's pale eyes fixed on Brida with predatory interest. "What about the child she carries? Are you willing to sacrifice them for your precious principles?" "I'm willing to trust that there are better ways to protect them than becoming a monster." "Again?" Magnus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Trust! You always were too soft, Phantom. That's why you never achieved true greatness. That's why you'll die forgotten in this miserable little farm while I become legend." "Then so be it." The finality in Thorfinn's voice seemed to surprise Magnus. For a moment, the raider leader studied his former comrade with something that might have been respect. "Very well," Magnus said finally. "You've chosen your path. Now live with the consequences, however briefly that may be." He remounted his horse, his companions following suit. As they prepared to leave, Magnus leaned forward in his saddle, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "When my enemies come for you, and they will come, remember that you could have prevented it. Remember that your wife's blood, your child's blood, is on your hands because you were too proud to accept my offer." The three riders disappeared into the morning mist, leaving behind only the echo of hoofbeats and the weight of unspoken threats. Thorfinn stood motionless in the yard until they were completely gone, then slowly turned to face Brida. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also proud, so very proud of the man I married." That evening, as they worked together to secure the farm against possible attack, Brida felt the first strong movement from the life growing inside her. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly, and Thorfinn was beside her instantly. "What is it? Are you hurt?" "No," she breathed, tears of joy streaming down her face. "The baby. It moved. It's strong, Thorfinn. It's fighting already." He placed his hand over hers, his scarred fingers gentle against the swell of her belly. For a moment, they stood together in the gathering darkness, feeling their child's restless movements, drawing strength from the promise of new life, even as old threats gathered around them. "By spring we'll meet our son," Thorfinn whispered, repeating the promise that had become their anchor. "By spring," Brida agreed, though winter was coming fast, and with it, dangers they could only begin to imagine. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing with it the kind of storm that Highland folk spoke of in hushed tones for generations afterward. The blizzard struck without warning in the early hours of morning, transforming their familiar world into a howling wilderness of white. By midday, snow had drifted against the windows of their stone house, and the wind screamed around the eaves. Like something alive and angry, it was in the midst of this chaos that Brida's pains began. She woke from an uneasy sleep to a sensation she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, a tightening across her belly that stole her breath and made her grip the bed covers with white knuckles. For a moment she lay still, hoping it was merely the discomfort that had been plaguing her for weeks, but when the pain came again, stronger and more insistent, she knew that their child had chosen this tempest to make its entrance into the world. "Thorfinn," she whispered, shaking her husband's shoulder. He woke instantly, the way men who had lived by violence learned to wake, alert and ready for danger. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "The baby?" he asked, sitting up quickly. "I think so. The pains started a few minutes ago." Another contraction seized her, and she couldn't suppress a small cry. "They're getting stronger." Thorfinn was on his feet immediately, lighting lamps and stoking the fire. Through the windows, they could see nothing but swirling white, no possibility of reaching help, no chance of summoning the experienced midwife who lived a day's ride away in good weather. "We're on our own," Thorfinn said quietly, as much to himself as to her. "But we can do this, Brida. Women have been having babies since the world began. We can do this." As the hours passed and the storm raged outside, Brida found herself caught between two kinds of tempest, the one howling around their house and the one building inside her own body. The pains came with increasing frequency and intensity, each one stealing her breath and making her question whether she was strong enough for what lay ahead. Thorfinn proved himself a steadfast companion through every moment. He held her hand when the contractions peaked, spoke to her in low, encouraging tones when she felt her strength failing, and never once betrayed his own fear, though she could see it flickering in his grey eyes. "Tell me about your mother," he said during a brief respite between pains. "Tell me about the songs she used to sing." Brida managed a weak smile. She had a voice like honey and sunlight. She could make the most frightened child calm just by a humming. Another contraction built, and she gripped his hand fiercely. "She used to say that every baby was a song waiting to be born." "Then what song is our child?" Thorfinn asked, stroking her sweat-dampened hair. "A song of hope," Brida gasped, as the pain crested and broke over her. "A song of healing, a song of two broken people learning to be whole." By evening, the contractions were coming so fast and hard that Brida could barely catch her breath between them. The storm outside seemed to mock their struggle, its howling wind matching her cries of pain. She found herself thinking of her mother, who had died bringing her own last child into the world, and terror seized her more completely than any physical agony. "I'm going to die," she whispered to Thorfinn during one of her brief moments of clarity. "Just like my mother. Promise me you'll save the baby. Promise me—" "No!" Thorfinn's voice cut through her fear like a blade. "You're not going to die, Brida. I won't let you. You're strong, stronger than you know. You've survived everything life has thrown at you so far, and you're going to survive this too." "But what if? No what ifs. Just us, right here, right now. You and me and our child fighting to be born." He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion and determination. "I need you, Brida. Our child needs you, so you're going to be strong for all of us." The final hours blurred together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Thorfinn had never delivered a baby, had no experience with the mysteries of birth, but he proved himself capable of remarkable gentleness and intuitive understanding. When Brida felt she couldn't push anymore, couldn't find the strength for one more effort, he was there with encouraging words and steady hands. "I can see the head," he said suddenly, his voice filled with wonder. "Brida, I can see our child. Just a little more. You're almost there." With a final surge of effort that seemed to draw on reserves she didn't know she possessed, Brida pushed their baby into the world. The child emerged into Thorfinn's waiting hands, red and slippery and perfect, filling their small house with the most beautiful sound either of them had ever heard. The baby's first cry rose above the storm's howling, strong and clear, and utterly alive. In that moment, as Thorfinn lifted their child with shaking hands, as Brida collapsed back against the pillows with tears of relief streaming down her face, the violence of the world outside seemed to pause in recognition of the miracle taking place within their stone walls. "A son," Thorfinn whispered, his voice breaking with joy. "We have a son." The moment their son drew his first breath, everything changed. The storm that had raged around their house seemed to pause, as if the very elements recognized the significance of this new life entering the world. Thorfinn held the baby with hands that had once wielded weapons of war, but now cradled the most precious thing he'd ever touched. A tiny, perfect human being who was part of him and part of the woman he loved, beyond all reason. "He's beautiful," Thorfinn whispered, his voice thick with tears he wasn't ashamed to shed. The baby was indeed beautiful, pink and healthy, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at his father with ancient wisdom. "He's perfect, Brida." Brida reached up weakly, her arms trembling with exhaustion, but strong enough to receive her son. When Thorfinn placed the baby against her chest, skin to skin, she felt a completeness she'd never known was possible. This child was hers, not a burden or a mistake, but a blessing, a continuation of the love she and Thorfinn had built together. "Hello, little one," she murmured, her fingertip tracing the baby's tiny cheek. "I'm your mother. I've been waiting so long to meet you." The baby turned toward her voice with the instinctive trust of a creature who recognized safety, love, home. His small fist curled around her finger with surprising strength, and Brida laughed through her tears at the fierce grip. "He's strong," she observed. "Listen to those lungs." Indeed, their son seemed determined to announce his arrival to the world, his cries lusty and demanding, despite the circumstances of his birth. Thorfinn found himself grinning foolishly at the sound. This child would not be overlooked or dismissed. He would make his presence known, claim his place in the world with confidence. "What shall we call him?" Thorfinn asked, settling beside Brida on the bed, his large frame creating a protective circle around his new family. Brida considered the question, studying her son's face in the lamplight. "Eric," she said finally, "after your grandfather, the one who taught your father that men could change, could choose to be better than their circumstances." Thorfinn's eyes widened with surprise and emotion. "You would name him for my family." "He is your family, our family." Brida shifted the baby so Thorfinn could see him better. "Eric Thorfinnsson, a name that speaks of heritage and hope, of the good that can come from difficult beginnings." As they spoke, the baby's cries gradually subsided into the satisfied grunts and snuffles of a newborn adjusting to life outside the womb. Thorfinn watched in fascination as Eric's eyes, still unfocused but alert, seemed to track the sound of his parents' voices. "By spring, we'll meet our son," Thorfinn said softly, repeating the promise that had sustained them through the dark months of winter. "You said those words when you first told me about the baby. Do you remember?" "I remember." Brida smiled, exhausted but radiant with joy. "And here he is, just as spring begins to stir. Your promise kept." Outside, as if in response to their words, the howling wind began to quiet. The blizzard that had trapped them in their own home for the birth was finally breaking, revealing the first pale light of dawn through the windows. The timing seemed almost mystical, their son born at the exact moment winter began its retreat, as if the seasons themselves had conspired to make his entrance memorable. "Look," Thorfinn said, nodding toward the window. "The storm is passing." Brida turned her head to see the transformation taking place outside their walls. Where there had been nothing but white chaos hours before, she could now make out the familiar shapes of their world emerging from the snow. The barn, the workshop, the garden where she would teach Eric to tend growing things when he was old. "Enough! It's a sign," she said with quiet certainty. "The worst is behind us now." Thorfinn leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Eric's head, breathing in the sweet scent of new life. "Welcome to the world, my son. Your mother and I have been preparing a place for you, a home where you'll be loved and valued, where you'll learn to be strong and kind and true to yourself." Eric stirred at the sound of his father's deep voice, making small sounds that seemed like an attempt at response. Brida marveled at how complete their little family felt, how the addition of this tiny person had somehow made them more than they'd been apart. "What do you think he'll be like?" she asked dreamily, running her fingers through the baby's dark hair. "What kind of man will he grow up to be?" "Kind, like his mother," Thorfinn said without hesitation. "Brave when he needs to be, gentle when gentleness serves better than strength. He'll know he's loved from his first breath to his last." He paused, his expression growing serious. "And he'll never know the kind of shame or rejection that marked our own childhoods. That cycle ends with us." As the morning light grew stronger and the storm finally exhausted itself, the three of them settled into the peaceful quiet that follows great exertion. Eric nursed hungrily at Brida's breast, his small hands kneading contentedly against her skin. Thorfinn kept watch over them both, his heart so full of love and gratitude that he could barely contain it. They had done it, survived the storm, brought new life safely into the world, kept faith with their promises to each other. Their son had arrived exactly as Thorfinn had vowed he would, by spring. Healthy and whole and perfect, the giant Viking's promise to his bride had been fulfilled, and their real life together was just beginning. Spring arrived in the highlands with unusual splendor that year, as if the very earth was celebrating the new life that had been born at Raven's Hollow. The snow melted early, revealing carpets of wildflowers that painted the hills in brilliant shades of purple and gold. The air carried the scent of heather and new grass, and the birds returned from their southern exile with songs that seemed more joyful than in years past. Brida stood at the kitchen window, Eric sleeping peacefully in her arms, watching Thorfinn work in the expanded garden they'd planned together. Their son was 3 months old now, a healthy, curious baby who seemed to find wonder in everything around him. His eyes had settled into the same clear grey as his father's, and he had already begun to smile with devastating charm at anyone who paid him attention. "Your father is building you a world," she whispered to the sleeping child, "a world where you'll know nothing but love and acceptance, where your worth will never be questioned." It had not been an easy transition to parenthood, despite the joy Eric brought to their lives. The sleepless nights, the constant demands of caring for an infant, the way their carefully ordered routine had been turned completely upside down, all of it had tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. But through it all, they had grown closer rather than more distant, united in their determination to give their son everything they had never received. The threat from Magnus had never materialized, though they had spent many anxious weeks waiting for it. Word had eventually reached them through traveling traders that the raider leader had been killed attempting to take a fortified town farther south, his men scattered to the winds. The danger from Thorfinn's past had ended not through violence or clever planning, but through the simple passage of time and the workings of fate. "Perhaps that's the lesson," Thorfinn had said when they received the news. "Sometimes the best way to fight our demons is simply to outlast them." Now, as she watched her husband teaching their son to appreciate the feeling of soft earth between small fingers, Brida reflected on how completely their lives had changed. The frightened young woman who had arrived at this farm less than 2 years ago seemed like a different person, someone she remembered with compassion but no longer resembled. She had a thriving healing practice now, with patients coming from farms throughout the region to seek her help. The wooden containers Thorfinn had made for her medicines had multiplied into an entire system of storage and organization, each one crafted with the same careful attention he gave to everything he touched. Their neighbors had come to respect and value her skills, and she had found deep satisfaction in using her mother's teachings to ease suffering and promote health. But more than that, she had found herself. The woman who had once made herself small to avoid notice now moved through the world with quiet confidence, secure in her own worth and the love of the family she had helped create. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the window, and she smiled to see their closest neighbors, Duncan and Moira MacLeod, riding up the path with their 2 young daughters. The families had grown close over the months since Eric's birth, bonded by the shared experiences of raising children in the sometimes harsh Highland landscape. "Brida!" Moira called out cheerfully as she dismounted. "We brought fresh bannocks and the yarn you wanted for Eric's winter clothes." "And I brought these," Duncan added, lifting a small wooden crate from his saddlebags. "Carved animals for the boy when he's old enough to appreciate them." Thorfinn emerged from the garden, wiping his hands on a rag, his face lighting up at the sight of their friends. Eric stirred at the sound of voices, his eyes opening to fix on the newcomers with the intense curiosity that seemed to be his defining characteristic. "Look at those eyes," Moira said, accepting the baby from Brida with practiced ease. "He sees everything, doesn't he? Mark my words, this one will be asking difficult questions before he can properly walk." They spent the afternoon in the comfortable companionship of people who had chosen to become family. The children played in the garden, while the adults shared news, advice, and the easy conversation of friends who had weathered difficulties together. As evening approached and their guests prepared to leave, Duncan pulled Thorfinn aside for a private word. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly. "There are rumors going around about your past. Nothing specific, mind you, but talk of the man you used to be before you came here." Thorfinn tensed slightly, his protective instincts flaring. "What kind of talk?" "The admiring kind, mostly. Stories about how the great warrior Thorfinn Eriksson gave up glory and riches to build a peaceful life with his family. About how even the fiercest wolf can choose to become a shepherd." Duncan smiled. "Your reputation as a man who found a better path is becoming as legendary as your reputation as a raider ever was." After their friends had gone, Brida and Thorfinn sat together on the bench Thorfinn had built outside their front door, watching the sun set over the hills that had become their sanctuary. Eric nursed contentedly at his mother's breast, his small hand resting trustingly against her skin. "Do you ever regret it?" Brida asked softly. "The life you gave up? The wealth you could have had if you'd stayed with men like Magnus?" Thorfinn considered the question seriously, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "How could I regret trading gold for this? Trading the respect of violent men for the love of a good woman and the trust of an innocent child?" He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I was rich before, Brida, but I was also empty. Now I have everything that matters." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Brida thought about the broken mirror that had once reflected only her flaws and limitations. In its place, she now had something far more valuable, the reflection she saw in Thorfinn's eyes, in Eric's trusting gaze, in the respect of neighbors who valued her skills and friendship. "By spring, we'll meet our son," she said quietly, repeating the promise that had carried them through their darkest moments. "And now we have," Thorfinn replied, his voice full of wonder that hadn't diminished in all the months since Eric's birth. "Our spring promise kept, our winter of waiting ended." In the workshop behind them, barely visible in the gathering darkness, sat Thorfinn's latest project, a carved wooden panel depicting their family of 3, surrounded by the symbols of their life together. The healer's herbs, the farmer's tools, The parents' love, all rendered in loving detail by hands that had learned to create instead of destroy. It was their story made manifest. Two broken souls who had found healing in each other's love, who had created new life and new hope from the ashes of old pain. A giant Viking and his bride, keeping faith with promises made in darkness, celebrating the light they had built together. Outside their door, spring bloomed eternal in the Highland hills, and inside their hearts, love had found its forever home.